Welcome to the TheForge Tutorials Maya Masterclass. In today's video, we are going to discuss how to manipulate objects in Maya. Now, the first thing we need to talk about is how to select objects in Maya. Now, to select object, you need to be on your selection tool. The shortcut for that is Q. Now that we are on our selection tool, you can select any object by simply left clicking on it. And if you want to deselect it, just click outside your scene and you can deselect that object. And if you want to select multiple objects in your scene, you can shift click. Just shift click on the next object that you want to select in your line. Just press shift plus your left mouse button on the objects that you want to select. You can also deselect them by shift clicking on them again, and that will deselect them. Now you might notice as you select more objects, the color of the previously selected objects go to white and the current one remains green. Now it is done to show you in which order you selected these objects. And some commands in Maya require you to select the objects in a certain order. You can also shift plus drag to select the objects. Now everything within that marquee will get selected. You can also do the same, shift plus drag to deselect an object from your selection. You can also use the lasso selection tool to select and deselect objects. It works like in any other software like Photoshop. You can just draw a selection over the objects that you want to select, and that will select those objects. You can also, in the same way like we did, shift plus drag to deselect from the currently selected objects or add to the currently selected objects. Let's deselect all of those. Now there are a few more ways in which you can affect your selection. If you double click on your selection tool, it will open the tool settings for the selection tool, and here you can uncheck the select back faces, so it won't select any back faces. You can also turn on the camera based selection, so you will only be able to select what your camera can see. And if you go down here into the soft selection menu, you can also enable soft selection. Now if you select the object option from the drop down menu, when you select an object, let's increase the diameter. You can see that the color of the objects that are around the object that we selected change. For example, imagine a bubble around the object that we selected, and it works like gravity. So the objects that are closer to the center of the object are affected by the selection more, and the objects that are farther away are affected by the selection less. So we selected these tree leaves, and if we move them, you can see that the other objects follow our main object softly. And the strength of that fall off is determined by our soft selection. Let's undo that. And from object mode, if we go to global, it will now affect the vertices or the faces and stretch everything in accordance with the radius of the soft selection that we have chosen. Let's undo that. So these are a few ways you can select and manipulate objects within Maya. Now let's take a look at our move tool. Now when you select an object and press the W key, that will activate your move tool, that is right here. And with the move tool, you can move the selected item in any of these three particular axes. Red being your x-axis, blue being your z-axis, and green being your y-axis. The green axis is right now yellow, which is to indicate that we have the y-axis selected. Any axis that you have selected currently will show as golden or yellow. So if I click on the z-axis, you can see that the y-axis is green. You can also move the object by clicking at the center of the pivot. This allows you to move the object in all three dimensions at the same time, which is highly inaccurate unless you're trying to snap that object to something else. Now you can also see there are these three flat planes. Now these three planes allow you to move that object in those two particular directions. So for example, this blue one lets you move the object in the y and x axis, and the green one lets you move it in the x and z axis, and the red one lets you move it in the y and z axis at the same time. The bottom one is green because in this the y-axis is locked. This one is blue because in this one the z-axis is blocked, and this is a red one because in this the x-axis is blocked and you cannot move it in the x-axis at all. So these are few ways you can move the object. If we jump from our perspective to the orthographic, You can see our orthographic views also restrict us to only 2 axes because this is a 2D view of our object. So from the top view we can only affect the X and Z axis, and from the front view we can only affect the Y and X axis. You can also use the soft selection in the move tool. If we go to our move tool and double click on it and go to soft selection and turn that on and increase our range, you can see the same thing happens that happened in our selection tool. Now we are in the object mode, so if we move, everything will move with our object. Let's turn that off right now. So that was our move tool. Now let's talk about our rotate tool. Now to access the rotate tool, you can either select the rotate tool from here, or you can press the E key, that is the shortcut for your rotate tool. Now the rotate tool also allows you to rotate your object in your 3 main axes, or you can use the camera based axis, that is this blue line. It lets you rotate the object from your perspective. Now the rotate tool is dependent on the pivot. So if we move our pivot, let's say from here to here, and then rotate our tool, it will rotate from that point. So the rotate tool is highly dependent on the pivot. And don't worry, in this lesson I will also tell you how to move and center the pivot. So let's move on to our scale tool. Now you can access the scale tool from here as well, or you can press the R key like I did. And just as we had in the move tool, you can scale the object in any particular axis, X, Y, Z. And you can also scale the whole object from the center by clicking on this box and dragging. And you also have your 2 axis control like XY, XZ and ZY. Now the scale tool as well is dependent on the pivot. So if we move the pivot here, so the object will scale behaving like the pivot is the center of the object. Let's undo that. So now that we know multiple ways to select, move, rotate and scale the object, let's talk about how to move and center the pivot. To move or center the pivot, all you need to do is press the D key on your keyboard. Keep it pressed down and you can edit your pivot. It will give you both the options to edit your pivot. You can rotate your pivot or you can move it. And when you stop pressing your D key, that will set your pivot in that 3D space. So now your object is centered at that point. And now when you rotate it, it will rotate considering that point as its center. You can also snap the pivot. So let's press D and V. V is for your snap to vertices. So I'm going to pick the pivot from the center and snap it to our object's vertices. So now our pivot is snapped to this vertex of our selection, and now we can rotate it from here. Now let's talk about how to center the pivot. Now to center the pivot, you need to go to your modify menu and click on the center pivot button. This will center your pivot to your object. You can also reset the transformations, but what this will do is it will return all the values, that is your translate, rotation and your scale, to 0. So any changes you have made in your object's translation, rotation and scale, it will set those to 0. Return your object to its default state. We are going to go in more detail about that when we talk about the channel box. So I think this is it for this video. So as always, if you like this video, subscribe to the channel, drop a like, leave a comment, and if you want to support me directly and buy some cool stuff, the link to my store and my Patreon is in the description. All the files that I use and create in my tutorials will be available on my Patreon with a few more perks if you're into that, and I'll see you in the next video.